All right, good afternoon, everyone. What's everyone doing? I know parking was tight today. We had a children's play going on in the music hall that I just let out. Coming back at 3, so hopefully it's Shrek 2. So hopefully we're gonna beat the noise that should flow through from there. But it's good to see everyone back here for the second installment of our 2026 Second Saturday Civil War series. Got just a few announcements before we get to our speaker. We did have a few winners for our raffle and bag. The winners are Colleen McGrath, General Reynolds, right here in the front row, Andy Wagner, Dave Thomas. Go up and grab your books and bag. I do see several new faces here today. It's a great crowd. If anyone is new, you haven't visited Captain Thomas SB Post. It's located right over my right shoulder here, right outside the room. The SB Post is open for tours every Saturday, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. We have docents that would love to give you a tour. So after the lecture here today, feel free to stop in there. And Chuck is our docent today. I call him Chuck Hills. He'd be happy to give you a tour. You will recall that last year we were awarded an America 250 grant to conserve 2 of our textiles from the SB Post. One of them was the vest to the uniform that you see in there, worn by an officer in the 77th Pennsylvania, and the other is a Zouave cloak, one of only 2 known in existence that was worn by a soldier in the 62nd Pennsylvania. Those went out to a conservator last August. They're coming back to us in just a few weeks. So when we're here for our March lecture or the symposium or anytime this spring, I hope you all will stop in and see these textiles. They're going to be on new forms. It's been a long time since they've been on display in the SB Post, so we're excited to have them back there, and I hope you will check those out. You'll recall for both of these, I had them out at our symposium several years ago asking for donations, and many of you graciously donated. But also for the raffles that we do for other donations that we get, that helped to serve as our cash match for those grants. So you all very much were instrumental in helping us to conserve these priceless artifacts in our collection. So thank you so much. Next month, we will be back here on March 21st. That is the 3rd Saturday in March. I know how much you all like your green beer. We've tried to do one St. Patty's weekend before and no one showed up. So we will be here on the 3rd Saturday of the month. And we will not be in this room. We will be downstairs in the studio. There is a play that will be going on the exact same time as our lecture, so I'm sure parking is going to be a little bit of a headache next month too, but I wasn't going to make our speaker try and talk over the noise that kind of comes out of the music hall. So downstairs in the studio, it should be great. We have Katie Wolf here talking about the influence of women, how women worked, served, sacrificed, and overcame during the Civil War. Katie was one of our speakers as the group lecture that we had about a year ago, and I thought she was wonderful. So that should be a good talk. Looking ahead to April, our symposium is going to be held on Friday and Saturday, April 17th and 18th. Our theme is 1861, Small Battles, Big Outcomes, in which we look at the military, political, social threads of that pivotal first year of the war. We have old friends from Symposia Past and some new friends coming as well. We have Chris Mikowski, my editor at Emerging Civil War, coming in to talk about the rise of Ulysses S. Grant following the Battle of Belmont. Chris's his most recent book, or I think he has like 1,000 books out. Just pulling out with John Adams just within the past few weeks, but his most recent book before that was a book on Ulysses S. Grant. Rich Condon, who's a good friend of the SB Post, been here many times with the National Park Service. He will be here to talk about the year of Jubilee, the Battle of Port Royal, and the birth of Reconstruction. Mark Malloy, also with the National Park Service, will be here to talk about the severe struggle of his life, Robert E. Lee's decision at Arlington House. Melissa Wynn from the museum, or from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and from Military Images, will be here to talk about healing open wounds, how First Manassas transformed medical care, in which she'll look at the innovations that were spawned following the unpreparedness of the nation following the First Battle of the Run. Rob Orison from Prince William County Historic Preservation will be here to talk about early actions on the Potomac River, those early skirmishes and battles and personalities relating to Confederate efforts to blockade the Potomac River. Ryan Quint, National Park Service Ranger from Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, will be here to talk about his recent book, on Battle of Drainsville that involved so many soldiers here from Western Pennsylvania. And Phil Sloggy, an editor with Military Images magazine, and as I like to say, just an all-around good guy, will be here to talk about arming the boys of 1861, the origins, differences, and challenges of arming Union soldiers. Phil is also going to bring along about a dozen original firearms from his collection that will be on exhibit here during the symposium, so you can meet with Phil and take a look at those. We're going to have a historians panel, Arsenal Cider, our local Civil War themed hard cider distillery. We'll be back for tastings and bottle sales. My mother will be running the cash bar. I'll also have our usual book sales and raffles. I've got some more artwork to raffle off. We'll have hors d'oeuvres Friday evening. We'll have breakfast and lunch here on Saturday and snacks throughout the weekend. Ticket sales are open until the first week of April. We can do a ticket for you today after the lecture if you would like. You can get one downstairs at the desk anytime. You can buy one on our website. Ticket prices are $100. That includes all of the speakers, all of your food, all of that stuff. So we'd love to see. We had over 200 people here last year, which was almost unmanageable. Don't do that to me again. No, but no, we're going to have a really good crowd here this year, and we'd love to see all of you come back, or if you haven't been to one, come check that out. All right, for today, Ron Coddington began collecting Civil War era portrait photography as a teenager, launching a lifelong pursuit to uncover images of men and women and tell their stories. His research has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and a series of books published by Johns Hopkins University Press, including Faces of Civil War Nurses that Ron has for sale back here today. You're only seeing a fraction of what is in this book here around the room, so I highly encourage all of you to pick up a copy of the book after the lecture. His most recent book is Gettysburg Faces by Gettysburg Publishing. Ron is the editor and publisher of Military Images, a quarterly magazine founded in 1979 dedicated to the study and preservation of historic photographs. Our library has been a long time subscriber to Military Images, so you can find it downstairs on our shelves. Ron has more than 40 years of experience as a journalist at USA Today, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Now, what I so appreciate about Ron's research is that the Civil War can be a big subject. It can be hard to get your arms around when you think about a few million, or about 3 million individuals involved in the war. It can be easy for them to become faceless when you talk about numbers like that. But Ron has taken these portrait images, he's researched the individuals, just common everyday people like you and me, and he has given them a face, he has given them a story. You can read about the generals, the politicians, but Ron is bringing us individuals, common people who fought, lived through, or died during the Civil War. Without his work, the images have survived, but so many of those stories have yet to be uncovered, and Ron has done such an incredible job at uncovering these stories. So you'll notice that the Abraham Lincoln wallpaper, as I lovingly call it, has come down, and you have this wonderful Faces of Civil War Nurses again. It will be here through the symposium, through our May 9th lecture. This is only the second stop for this exhibit. Last summer, it was on display at the Clara Barton Soldier's Office in Washington, D.C. I was even featured on CBS Sunday Morning News as well. You may have seen it there. So we're really excited to have it here. And after it leaves here, it's going to travel on to the next stop. So if you didn't have time to look at the exhibit here before the lecture today, we're going to be having an opening reception here immediately after, where you can speak with Ron, you can get a book, you can quiz him on all these images, and I'm sure he would love to tell you about them. There's some food and drink still available in back. I hope there's still some left. This is a big crowd. But please stick around, speak with Ron, and read about these amazing women. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ron Coddington.
Hey, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. Big thanks to John, Eric, and to all of you for being here today. Doing this kind of work, researching, finding these images, it sort of conjures up these solitary people like me deep on the research trail, dim lights around us. That is partially true. It is really a team sport. It takes a lot of folks to bring images and stories to all of you. And so in this case, Military Images Magazine and the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, John Eric mentioned earlier, we're partnering up to do this. The mission sounds relatively simple. We want to bring these images and stories to you, to the communities. So my job today is to help you as you're walking around and looking at all of these images. I want to give you some context. I want to give you some background so that when you look at these generally ordinary women who did extraordinary things, you can get some sense of the backstory. Yeah. So let's start with the images. A little joke I like to tell folks. It's not even much of a joke. The idea is I like to start my research backwards. I begin with the images, and these images have largely been in private hands. All of these images around you, they were never intended for public consumption. They were intended for photo albums, for vest pockets, for fireplace mantles, that kind of thing. So the images, I think, are a great place to start. And Mary Moore's husband, we can look at her in a couple of different ways. We can see her as the woman who was at Antietam at the hospitals, at Smoketown Hospital, but we can also look at her clothing. What is she telling us? What does she want us to see? Well, she wants us to see her apron. And this was a custom designed apron because nurses did not have uniforms at that time. She made her own serviceable apron with these very deep pockets. And as the boys in the hospital wards were asking her for chef sets, for writing paper, for pencils, she would jot down what they wanted and she would find them and she would fill those deep pockets with gifts for the boys and deliver them on her next trip to the ward. So she is wanting us to see that apron. She wants us to understand what her role was in the war as a nurse in a very visual format. So Mary is just one fashion statement, if you will. We can look at some others. Marie Technique, I've had a couple of conversations, several conversations about her today. She's sort of on the other side of the scale. She's a vivandière. She is wanting us to see what she looks like in the field. She has her own version of a Zouave uniform, borrowing from the traditions of her regiment, and also borrowing from her traditions from France, the idea of carrying the jug, the air with her. She, of course, also has a weapon, a holstered weapon strapped to her, and she is ready for battle. She's ready to be on the front lines, and she wants you to know it. And then on another part of the spectrum of the scale, we have Helen Gilson. And Helen wears the kind of outfit that Dorothy and Dix would love. It's plain, it's simple, it almost looks to be homespun. There's not a lot of ornamentation here. And those of you who know Dorothy Dix know that she did not want folks to look beautiful or to look attractive. Plain looks were really important. Plain clothes were important. And Helen wore this way out in the field. She was one of those very early nurses who left her job as a nanny in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and came down to Virginia to take care of the local boys that were wounded in the various battles in Virginia. And she was corresponding with her hometown, along with her boss, who was the mayor of Chelsea. So they were working almost independently to supply and take care of local soldiers. Last but not least, another part of the spectrum Sister Ignatius Farley. John, Eric can tell you in depth about her story. She out of Wheeling, and she is wearing her nurse's habit, which is what you would expect a woman of her faith to wear. So all this is to say, as you were, if we were going back into the 1860s during the Civil War, and you were interacting with these women, you might not even necessarily know they were nurses until you saw them actually doing their work. So, as you're looking at these images, let's talk a little bit about why they existed and why they matter and how they came to be. You can easily call the Civil War generation the photography generation. Photography is born in 1839. It's only about what, 22 years old when the war begins. And you all know Matthew Brady, right? If there's one name you know connected with photography, it's Matthew Brady. What you might not know or might not think about quite so much is he was really a celebrity photographer. All of the movers and the shakers and politics and culture and faith-based organizations, he was the guy who was capturing their likenesses. And he did it really, really well. And then when the Civil War came along, he morphed from the celebrity photographer to the father of photojournalism. To me, that's mind-blowing. How someone could put their entire career, everything online, and move out into the field to photograph a war that no one knew how long it was going to last, what it was going to be all about, and what kind of sacrifice the country would have to make. So all of them, not all of them, but a number of those early images that you know so well, the battlefield images, were either taken by Brady's team or inspired by Brady's work. I think that's fair to say. That first foray involves not battlefield photography, but portrait photography. And it's largely forgotten. The summer of 1861, the defenses of Washington, D.C., what's happening? Soldiers, volunteers from Michigan, from Ohio, from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, they are descending upon Washington, D.C. to save the capital. And they're building defensive lines, particularly on the Virginia border, for obvious reasons. And what does Brady do? He sends out teams from his DC location to begin photographing what is ultimately the first defenders of our country during the Civil War. These are the first defenders of the Capitol, and you can see them. They're not necessarily wearing uniforms you recognize, and yet they made their way from various locations across the country. You begin to get a sense of what camp life was like. And remember, these are mostly citizen soldiers and volunteers, including nurses, who are beginning to adjust to a military world with which they are very unfamiliar. All of this builds on the work of this man. Do you know Daguerre? Right? He invented the first commercially successful form of photography. He didn't do it alone. He was working on the shoulders. He was standing on the shoulders of folks who were fascinated by phosphorus chemicals and capturing sunlight and making permanent images. So 1839, it's launched. The world is taken by storm. Not everyone is very jazzed about this idea. Even though France gives it to the world, there's no charge, there's no license. This is a gift to the world. Not everybody's happy. Blackwood's magazine, they're very worried that technology, this new technology, it's going to be the end of the world. What will become of the poor thieves when they shall see handed in as evidence against them their own portraits? taken by the room in which they stole, and in the very act of stealing. Now, everything and everybody may have to encounter his double everywhere, most inconveniently. What's going to happen? Are the cameras going to get behind us, in front of us? Are they going to take us over? We don't know. Blackwoods Magazine is very worried about this. You see where this goes, right? We start to get worried about where is in control. Is the human race losing the battle against technology? Gets worse. Here's a revolution in art. They haven't even invented in 1839. They don't have the name photograph yet. The daguerreoscope, the photogenic revolution. This is going to keep everybody down. If you're a painter, if you're an engraver, if you just like to draw, it's game over. Your life is done. Where does this go, right? Your jobs are being taken away. You're going to be replaced. This is very similar. This is not only in our era and in 1839, all the years between those two time points, and of course into the future, we will continue to deal with this as human beings. Meanwhile, the idea of what photography is also being questioned. There's a French publication crediting Louis Dodaro with this idea, and it's a crazy idea, that photography should be used for what they call utilitarian purposes. You want to put these into practice, it can be used for personal identification, business cards, official documents, passports, hunting licenses. These will help us be more responsible in our world, and photography can help us do that. And then, of course, we have to look to photographers to help make that transition and get away from simple portrait photography. This journal, the Practical Mechanics Journal, goes ahead and says, you know, one of the things we can do with photography is you can make life easier for the traveling salesman. You don't need your wagon anymore full of goods. Just carry along your photographs. It's going to make your life simpler. You see where this goes, right? The ideas that we live with today, I think you could fairly argue, have its origins in the utility of photography to streamline how business is being done and how people communicate, certainly as regards commerce. Now, of course, this is a British publication, and they're going to poke fun or poke at their American cousins. The Yankee manufacturer, it is said, does not descend to the prosaic planet of creating its name on visiting cards, but he fills his card case with photographs of himself, which he hands in sad. Basically, I'll translate that for you. Yankees are arrogant, and we really want to look at ourselves.
Oh,
Truth is, it's not just Yankees, it's not just Americans. We all have this need. This is universal. We want to shine a light on ourselves, our friends, and communities in which we live. I should pause here for just a moment to show you the backs of some photographs. If you think it's a man's world, it largely was. But we're finding increasing evidence that women were also photographers and quite good at it. A recent study of Illinois photographers unearthed 14 women alone who were working during the Civil War. So multiply that times 36 states and whatever number you get there, you're easily in the hundreds, maybe over 500 women who occupy the role of photographer. And when men were being called to join the army, we also found evidence of photographers who need assistance and employees turning to women to add to their workforce. So let's pretend that we're going into our local photographer studio to have our portrait made in 1861. You generally have two options. Technology affords you two options. The first is paper. These are invented, if it's 1861, just like 5 years earlier. Actually, the origins of the idea are before that, but the commercial popularity of paper images really take off in the latter part of the 1850s with the carte de visite or visiting card. These are baseball-sized images. These are the very social, these are the Facebook. These images are the Facebook of the 1860s. Friends, family, comrades in arms, photograph albums invented to house these images. That's the carte de visite, that's the paper photograph. That's an option for you. So be thinking about that when you walk into the studio. Do you want to have an image you have all your friends? Do you want to buy a dozen of them? Or do you want something that's more artisanal? You might want a tin type or an amber type that's iron or glass, an individual item, a single item that you could send home to mom and dad, your brother, your sister, your wife, your grandparents. It's more personal. Your wife, it's more personal. These items, they're not easily copied, and they often have cases, as you can see here in these examples, and these are been made for display. The good news is when you walk into the photo gallery, your photographer is happy to sell you as many as you want. Don't worry about cost. You can get that artisanal tintype or ambrotype to send home to the family, to be on the mantelpiece, or to give to your wife or someone else in the family to put in a vest pocket. Or you can get a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 1,000 cartes de visite that are printed from glass plate negatives on paper and mounted to cardstock, and you can hand them out to anyone. Yeah, I did a little estimate, and by my figure, about 40 million images were produced just carte de visite during the Civil War period of soldiers. And I figured this out by thinking 2.5 million soldiers and sailors. You get an image made early in the war. You might get a second one made after you're re-enlisted, and then maybe a third one if you survive. A third one made at the end of the war. 40 million. Every 2 minutes, we take as many photographs as were taken in the entire 19th century. So it sounds like a lot, but it's really not. The good news is that these images, these very personal images, whether they're tintypes or ambrotypes or cartes de visite, they were pretty much stayed with families until the 1960s, the centennial, when they started to move into the collector's world. Some are still with families, but between the families and the collectors, we are the keepers of history. We're the caretakers of these images. So that's something to think about, because none of these images that you see around you, I don't know what they would have thought if they walked in here today and listened to us talking about it. But that's supposed to be an album hidden in the parlor. Something else to think about. We'll move away from photography. Guess what? You're a nurse. Everyone's a nurse. In working on this project, Florence Nightingale, you realize how big a character she is in all of this. Her book, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, was published in 1859. In the opening, every woman, or at least almost every woman in England, has, at one time or another of her life, charge of the personal health of somebody, whether child or invalid. In other words, every woman is a nurse. It's a significant concept, and her book goes on to detail all of this. I want to get a sense of how much of an impact she had in America. So I took a look at the study of over 7,000 mentions in newspapers, thanks to newspapers.com, between 1854, beginning of the Crimean War, to 1865, and of our Civil War. And as you can see, during the Crimean War, her reputation is growing. Her name is being mentioned again and again and again. Her book comes out in 59 and 60. It really jumps up. The US edition of the book also comes out that year. That's sort of a pinnacle of her popularity, at least during this period of time. And then throughout the war, it tends to be, it drops, but it's relatively steady. So the purpose for sharing this with you is to understand that her name and her work is getting out. It's being mentioned a lot in newspapers, which is the major media source of that time. In her American edition, there's an extra page that you won't find in the British edition. And she says, sure, if there was heroism and dashing up the heights of Alma, seeking glory at the cannon's mouth in defiance of death and of all mortal opposition, amid the shouts of the victors and the cries of the vanquished, there was heroism unparalleled and calmly volunteering to minister to the fever-stricken and the dying. Clara Barton likes this idea. She has her own version of it. She's inspired, right? As many women are. Clara Barton writes, while they march on with tread of iron, she's beckoning knights of old and plumes proudly tossing in the breeze. Someone must follow closely in their steps, crouching to the earth, toiling in the rain and darkness, shelterless like themselves, with no thought of pride or glory, fame or praise or reward, hearts breaking with pity, faces bathed in tears, and hands in blood. This is the side which history never shows. She makes it sound glorious, and it certainly was to a certain extent, especially when you're looking back in time at it. Georgie Woolsey, who later marries and becomes Georgiana Bacon, in her letters of the family, she was a nurse, and she writes, no one knows who did not watch the thing from the beginning, how much opposition, how much ill will, how much unfeeling want of thought these women nurses endured. Hardly a surgeon whom I could think of received or treated them with even common courtesy. Issues that women of her time would struggle with, issues that we all struggle with today. She's calling out the men surgeons. She has as much trouble with them as she did with patients. These annoyances, she continues, could not have been endured by the nurses, but, and this is important, but for the knowledge that they were pioneers. She knew it. They were pioneers who were, if possible, to gain standing ground for others who must create the position they wished to occupy. Their shoulders, right? She's conscious that they're going to be the shoulders that future generations are going to stand upon. She's writing this during the Civil War. Something else to think about. This sounds really simple. How do you define what a nurse is? I had a hard time figuring this out. When you begin to dig into the research and begin to understand all of the ways that these women surrounding us, how they became involved, why they became involved, who they were, what backgrounds they were from. It's hard to understand, and what they did, very difficult. I finally came up with what I think is kind of a simple definition. It's the common elements that they shared. And it's, like I say, it's simple. They attended to a wounded or a sick soldier in some capacity on at least one occasion. So that's a way of saying that their circumstances were very different, how they became exposed to war and what they did in that moment is very different. And we're going to look at some of those ways. I think you all must be familiar, certainly students of the Civil War, with Jessie Fremont, the wife of the Pathfinder John C. Fremont. She was instrumental in establishing the Western Sanitary Commission, which is related to the U.S. Sanitary Commission, obviously the Western version of it. She had minimal direct contact. I got only one reference of her visiting a hospital and actually being with the patients. But what she did do is work behind the scenes, inspired by what she saw, inspired by her sense of duty to become involved. That's one definition, or one variation on that definition. Here's another one. Fanny Ricketts, her husband, a very specific individual, her husband was desperately wounded at First Bull Run. She was in Washington. What did she do? She wasn't a formal nurse. She was one of Florence Nightingale's. Every woman is a nurse. Well, she hired a carriage. She went out. She crossed into enemy territory, found her husband, took care of him, traveled with him to prison in Richmond, took care of him some more. And that's her nursing service. One man, her husband, she cared for him. Carrie McGath in Tennessee, in Franklin, the Battle of Franklin. She was far away for the most part from front lines until late 1864, when the battle came literally to her home, to her backyard. A description of her by a Confederate officer walking around her home. There's pools of blood where surgery was being done. The bottom of her skirt is drenched in blood. That's the description. Primary source from a letter by a soldier that was wounded in her house. Another way that I would say qualifies one as a nurse. The wife of one of Lincoln's cabinet secretaries, war came to her city. She got involved. She started visiting the hospitals. It's around Christmas of 1862. She's like, these guys got to have proper dinner. They got to have turkey and all the trimmings and the pies and all of that. Well, she organized dinner for 25,000. While that was happening, a little battle called Fredericksburg going on. And those casualties came pouring in. So war came to her city and she acted. Another example of war coming to your city, Otelia Mahone, the wife of a Confederate General William Mahone, living in Richmond. Her husband was wounded. She took care of him. She remained working in the hospitals in Richmond during much of the drama that played out there in 64 and 65. And then there's folks like Marianne Bickerdike. In some ways, if you recall the story of Helen Gilson, sort of similar. She's up north in the Midwest at home. She's hearing these horrible stories of soldiers dying of disease, not getting proper food, proper nutrition, dirty clothes, all of that. And The folks in town take up a collection, they get a bunch of supplies together, she trucks them down. She doesn't even have permission, she just heads down. She talks her way into getting into the Union lines, into camps, and begins this back and forth with bringing supplies, bringing care, then gaining later on, gaining the trust of folks like General Sherman to help take care of her and get her the needs, get her the hospital supplies that she needs. She never quits. She keeps on going. How many lives did she save? I don't know that we could know that, but certainly the work that she did for cleanliness and diet and caregiving, how do you measure that? Annie Stubbs. She's on another part of the spectrum. She goes through formal channels. She signs up to be a nurse. She is declined. She is persistent. She applies again. She eventually gets accepted, and she is assigned to the hospitals in Tennessee, where she is taking care of as many patients as she can. This image of her is slightly after the war, and I don't know if you would recognize her in this photo as much as you might with this photograph. A well-known image. This is Annie in the hospitals in Tennessee, taking care of patients. This is obviously a reenactment, if you will. This is an image that was meant to demonstrate how care is being given. There's a letter about this particular photograph. The sanitary commission I spoke about earlier, they wanted to copy this photograph, make a bunch of copies, hundreds if not thousands, and sell them to raise money, support the union cause, to make sure they could raise supplies. That was one of the missions of the sanitary commission. And her reply, she said, "You want to use my likeness?" I'll go into modern language, not 19th century vernacular. So you want to use my brand? You want to use my likeness? I don't think so. But then she understands, she comes around to the idea that she's actually helping the cause. So photography is also illustrating this idea of your personal brand and how that could be marketed. In this case, in the service of a greater cause than her. Now, another way to look at this, motivations. You look around at these women, at these nurses. We talked about the circumstances in which they found themselves, but sort of what motivated them. I mean, you could be surrounded by all this and not participate, right? You could say, this is not for me, but in that moment, something in them clicked and got them to be involved. Felicia Grundy Porter in Nashville. She's the daughter of a United States senator earlier in the country's history. And there's no doubt in her mind that her motivation is duty to serve. It pops up over and over again. Duty to country. Her country is the state of Tennessee and the Confederate States of America. She believes in that. She is working within her town, her city, even after Union occupation, to raise money. She also petitions Jefferson Davis to establish some larger organization similar to the United States and Western Sanitary Commissions, or another organization I did not mention, the Christian Commission, looking for some national organization to care for Southern soldiers. That doesn't happen because there's not enough money and there's not enough resources. But she's driven, and her actions speak to it. Duty country. Here's one that is quite common. My brother has joined the army. I'm going into it. How do I get in? I think you all maybe have read some of the accounts of women getting in as soldiers and sometimes getting away with it, sometimes being caught. I think one document was 400 that I've seen, or one documented number. There's many more women who were inspired by a family member, and in a few cases, I found they inspired their family members to join after they became nurses. So a fairly common entry point is one of your members of your family is in uniform, I'm going. Faith. Your job to be able to care for others, care for those in need in the world. Your faith teaches you that, you practice it from sun up to sundown. It's part of who you are. And when a major catastrophe strikes, when massive humanitarian crisis sweeps regions of the country, you're bound by faith. If you've been watching the news recently, I've been thinking about Sister Anne Alexis Shore and Sister Ignatius Farley, the venerable monks who have been marching across the country, spreading their message of peace, just of peace. I think that these women are doing the same thing as they're helping to rebuild bodies to help people heal. Georgie Stratton, she came into this strictly to be a social reformer. She was in New Jersey. She came down to Washington, D.C. She desperately wanted to help teach freedom. She was an educator. She believed in education. She knew that when emancipation happened, and later on the amendments to our Constitution, that to be good citizens, you needed to be educated. And so she came down to Washington, and she might have continued to do that until she began to see the casualties from the Overland campaign come up into Washington, D.C. and realized there was a need for nurses. That need for nurses was in some ways more acute, at least in the moment, for educators. And so she took some time off, a couple of tours of duty in the hospitals of Virginia. Harriet Tubman. You all know her. Thanks. Freedom fighter. She's there for certainly similar reasons to others on these slides, but she also is fighting for her race. She's fighting for freedom over and over again. She's not alone. There are 200,000 U.S. colored troops, sailors, who many of them will say the same thing. Harriet Tubman stood up and did it in the way that she could. A very small group that I encountered were doctors who wanted to be part of all this. The great joy that I found in finding these individuals was learning about their medical educations mostly in the mid-1850s in progressive institutions of learning, getting their degrees and figuring out how to get started in the world, and then setting that career aside to work for hospitals, and then facing the sorrow of not being allowed to be doctors. They could be nurses, they could be matrons of hospitals, but the world hadn't changed enough yet to allow them to become doctors. Now, after the war, a number of the women that I researched go on to become doctors. So in some ways, the horrors of war also helped spur some of the progressive movement, at least around medical profession. So before we get into questions, I'll leave you with a final thought. If you hadn't got the message by now, these images, I appreciate them as visual documents of our history. And I think they're really, really important. And it's such a simple but powerful idea to look into the eyes of one of these women and then read their story and learn about who they are. It oftentimes makes me think about myself and about who I am as a person. You know, you read, if you read biographies, you start to model your behavior, your character, right, on those whom you admire. A lot of this is happening for me. Melissa Vale, she later remarried, became Melissa Case after her husband died. She was in her mid-40s, mid to late 40s during the war. And I found her documents, and I've looked at probably, I mean, I think it's conservative to say thousands, maybe more than 10,000 documents, books, pension files, letters, journals, newspaper articles, you know, all this. And some of those documents stay with me. And they also challenge me to think about what I would do in a certain situation. And buried in Melissa's pension file is a document that I keep thinking about. And I haven't shared it with any of my talks before. And so you all get to see this. And it's this. Dorothea Dix. It's dated Washington, May 10th, 1864. It's addressed to Melissa and another nurse. And it's one line. Come quickly if you can. Work hard. And I think to myself, if I was at home, nowadays it would probably be a text. Right? And a text you're like, come quickly if you can work hard. What would you do? I don't know how I would answer that question. But Melissa answered it. She packed her bag and she was on a train that evening to help with the war effort. So, thanks for listening. I'm happy to put it on. We might have some Zoom. If you got a question on Zoom.
You have a comment. Thank you so much for this great presentation from Thalia.
Thank you.
I see none of the women have smiles. Is that because they have a long exposure for the fiction?
Yeah, the question is, none of the women have smiled. Why is that? It's not that they're unhappy.
Wait.
Well, there's several factors. One of them is certainly, to an extent, you might argue it's exposure times. However, by the time of the Civil War, exposure times had come down dramatically. And so you could, if you wanted to hold a pose for some length of time, an exposure time, 10, 15 seconds, maybe even less, maybe slightly more, you could certainly do that. I think other explanations come into play, which is all of these folks, as part of the photography generation, they grew up with the beginning of photography, but they also grew up with engravings in books. And who did they see? And how are those people expressing themselves? They were not smiling generally.
Dour.
Yes, dour is the perfect word to describe it. And so that's I think part of it is the imitation. And yet there are images, you will find images of smiling soldiers. One that I have in my collection is the guy thumbing his nose. Photographer. So trust me, folks, if they want to get crazy, they will get crazy. But when they do that, they're really bucking the norm.
What is your opinion or your thought on this new AI where they bring these images to life?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Can you repeat it?
Oh, yeah, sorry. What is my opinion of AI and bringing historic military images and other 19th century images to life? And so my feeling is I have sort of two tracks of thinking. One of them is I go back to the 1990s when Photoshop became a thing and everyone was colorizing photographs. And there were a bunch of folks who were saying, this is horrible. you shouldn't be doing this. You should leave these images pure and treat them as the historical artifacts that they are. I think it's the same argument today, you know, the idea of technology challenging what we think and spreading fear and concern, as it was with photography. Same thing with AI. This is a byproduct of that. I do think that if using, we can't avoid it. People are going to use artificial intelligence to animate, to colorize, to add voices. Where we are now is in the very beginning of this new era. I don't know where it's going to go. And we'll be very curious to find out. So to me, it's an unstoppable force. And I don't think that trying to push it away, it's not going to stop it. What we should do is, at least what I'm going to do, is I embrace it as something that exists. And it also makes me think more critically about Military Images magazine and the work that I do. You're not going to find AI in the magazine or my books because that's not my mission. If my mission was to make Mary Moore's husband talk, well, then I would probably be learning the AI tools. If I was going to have her tell me about Antietam and Smoketown Hospital, sure, I would, you know, maybe have fun doing that. But that's not what I'm doing. And so, if anything, the AI revolution, like the photogenic revolution that we talked about, it makes me more desirable to make sure that these stories and these images are being shared. Yes, ma'am.
Were any of these nurses particularly known for offering aid to Confederate soldiers as well as Union and vice versa?
Thank you for that question. The question is, union nurses, you're in a hospital, there's Confederates there, what do? Right? And what I have found in researching is some of the nurses don't talk about it. Those that do talk about it and are descriptive will talk about their initial feelings of being repulsed by the enemy until they see the gaping wound or until they hear the congested cough or the amputated limb. And that idea of being an enemy, when you see a young, as one of the nurses here treating a young lieutenant left behind at Gettysburg, he was a boy and he wanted to make it. And she writes about having to come to terms with the fact that he's just a boy. He's on the other side of the conflict, but in this moment, he's a boy. He's a human. Yeah, it's true.
Were they getting like formal training at all?
Yeah, the question about formal training, you might intuit from the various ways they became involved in the war. For the most part, I've seen very little evidence of training. There was some. There was certainly instructional, like you could read Florence Nightingale's book. I wouldn't be surprised if nurses had that. I didn't study how much training they had in depth, so I can't speak to any larger professional training that was done. But I do think between the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, there must have been some help in that area for those nurses who were intentional and wanted to be nurses in hospitals. And then I think of folks like Karen McGavick at the Battle of Franklin, where there's no way she could even be prepared to know what she was dealing with. So she just went with her instincts. I think you're right, yes, sir.
Yeah, the other day I looked up on the internet, the most trusted profession and the least trusted professions. The bottom, used car salesmen and politicians. At the top, I thought it might be priests or doctors. It was nurses.
Well, the question or the statement, the comment was about least respected professions, and most nurses being at the top. And my reply to this would be, I would say that these women have done their job very well. If you buy into George H. Woolsey's comments about they being the pioneers and then being the shoulders for others to stand upon, I think that they deserve a share of credit for that. Yes, John.
You have a few questions from Zoom.
Okay.
Diane in South Carolina wants to know if during the course of your research, did you find anything on the Sisters of Mercy who were here in Pittsburgh nursing the soldiers? Did you come across anything about them?
I know that I crossed paths with their organization and some of their deeds. What I do not recall finding is a wartime image of a member. And I should have said this at an earlier point. All the images in the exhibit and all the images that I researched for the nurses book and other projects, I want wartime images because I think it's really important to see them as they look at the time. And that can be problematic because I can miss the Sisters of Mercy entirely because I haven't found a photograph of them. On the flip side, the images that I do find revealing the stories that they hold that are behind those images, there's a joy in that.
And Emily, who watches from California every month, thank you, Emily. She said that was an excellent and thought-provoking presentation, that you've done a great public service in tracking down all these photographs and making them available. She has a few questions here. One, could you repeat the reference to that 400 number that you had mentioned during the program? Was that?
Oh, she might be thinking about the 40 million photographs.
40 million? Okay.
Yeah, 40 million photographs is my estimate of how many Union soldier photographs were taken during the war.
And then she also wanted to know, did you come across any female nurses or doctors that served as correspondents during the war, like to a newspaper, or were any of them writing letters that were published during the war?
I certainly have found, there are letters that you will find. The correspondence that I have uncovered or found in newspapers, for example, it tends to fall into three categories. You have some folks that are relatively regular correspondents. Very few fall to that category. Then there is an occasional correspondence. You might get a letter in July of 1863, and then another one in September, and another one in April of 64. Occasional. And then the last group is a letter that's wasn't intended necessarily to become public, but for example, your daughter who is a nurse might send a letter home to mom and dad, and they'll read it and they'll go, wow, I just got this letter and there's some interesting news here about the boys from our hometown. And they'll walk it over to the newspaper editor and say, look what I have. And they will transcribe that, typeset it, and publish it. So that's sort of the one-off situation.
All right.
Yes, sir.
In your research, did you uncover any stories where the care provided by a nurse to a soldier resulted in matrimony?
Question of, did correspondence or communications lead to matrimony? Yes. I don't quote me on this exactly, but I believe 3 of the women in the book either married a patient or married the doctor. We're all peoples.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, ma'am, you had a question?
I was wondering if we want to pursue this topic, is there any book that stands out in your estimation of Civil War nurses that would be a good place to go to read more? Yeah.
Yes, there are, I love primary sources. Because the closer I can get to what people were thinking, how they were writing, what their experience was during this period, that really gets me going. And I should also say, you have to realize when you're reading primary source records that you're dealing with the point of view of one person and the body of knowledge they have in that moment. There are 2 books both published in 1867. I'm completely blanking on the title at the moment. But if you look up women, one of them is called, sorry, I'm completely blanking, but they were published not long after the war. Oh, one of them is Women's Work in the War. They're effectively regimental histories. I should say, yeah, they're the equivalent of regimental histories. They're celebrating the work of women across the country. So, if you'll, best I can do in this moment is if you'll send me an email, I'll get you the information and you can look into that. I think that would be a good place to start. Beyond that, there are a number of books that I would recommend. I did a piece in the Wall Street Journal, asked me to do my 5 picks for nurses books. If you subscribe to the journal, you can look that up. If you don't, I think you can get down, maybe you'll get one of them. Yes, ma'am.
Why did Harriet Tubman change her name to Harriet Tubman? Why did she just stick with her original name?
I have to confess, that was not part of my research.
Um,
I'm really interested, in,
well,
what-
it was brought up on the picture, that's what.
yes, it's not something I went into, in depth. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, you probably saw the Ken Burns documentaries on, there was one on the Revolutionary War. In the Civil War, you think he could have given a little more attention to women and nurses in those documentaries?
You know,
I can't remember too much of what they said, but I don't remember too close on them.
Ken Burns, the Civil War series. When I think about the fact that it was it 1990?
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah. The way that we talked about the Civil War at that time was certainly in some ways framed by Ken Burns's work. He tried to get at many of those narratives touching on the role of doctors, the role of African Americans, tried to paint that more complicated, nuanced picture. I don't know that he could he have done more? Sure. But considering the time he was working in, he was changing, he was capturing a change in storytelling at that time. And many of us, I think, are sort of standing on his shoulders. At least I will say, people like me who were inspired to think about these individuals and have an aha moment of like, oh, what did the doctor do? What did the nurse do? And so yeah, I think he played a role. One question I would ask him would be if he was to redo it today, if he was to do it, a refreshed version, would he do something different?
I was gonna say that Louisa May Alcott's hospital sketches, although it's a fictionalized account of her experiences in the hospital in Washington DC, Union Hospital, Washington DC.
Yeah.
And that was published, I think, even during the Civil War, and it was the first time there was an account of how soldiers were being taken care of. So I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, the comment was about Louisa May Alcott, her hospital sketches. She's not in the hospitals for long, I must say, it's just a few months. And the book is relatively short, but it was published.
And still in print.
Yeah, you can still find it. You can also find it digital when I get there. But it does, for all the reasons that you pointed to, she is beginning to raise awareness about nursing. And I wouldn't necessarily call it an instructional manual by any circumstance. But because it's a personal narrative, because it's a primary source, you have an individual who is sharing their experience. And I think within that, it's motivating others. And I think it's a real value of it at the time. And I want to say that it was also published to support the war effort. I'd have to check my facts now, but I think it was, the reason it was published, I think, had meaning behind it. Yes, ma'am. No.
Last month, there was a speaker here called Ron Kirkwood, and he wrote a book called Too Much for Human Endurance, which I'm reading right now. And he's got several chapters about the nurses and the doctors during the Civil War, focusing on Gettysburg and the hospitals at the Spangler Farm. But he really does go into depth about some of the nurses there.
That sounds like a recommendation for his book.
Yeah.
So, great, yeah, so if you wanna learn more, there's another recommendation. I haven't read it, but I'm aware of it. And, when I was researching this project, you find first person accounts of these nurses. One of the women you can read about, she's trying to get from sort of, things that I didn't think about so much. You're trying to get from, I think she was in Baltimore, and she's trying to get to Gettysburg. And she's trying to, the act of trying to get to Gettysburg in what is still an active war zone. They're not sure what the Confederates are gonna do. So you have, and you were like, I'm going. It's like, wow, that's rather impressive. And like wagons, trains, whoever she can catch a ride with, she ultimately hops a train that's heading in the direction of Gettysburg, and she slides open the door, and what does she find inside? Caskets. How do you feel? How did she feel in that moment? She told us what she saw. She didn't say how she felt about it. But I think that story is one that stays with me. I think it's also sort of emblematic of the courage of these individuals.
Take one last question from Paul back here, and then we'll wrap.
So the next two major wars after the Civil War, 33 years later, Spanish American, 53 years later, World War I. Was there any mentoring or just informal correspondence between these ladies and the ladies who did the similar service, in the next wars? And then the last thing you mentioned were, of course, is that Marie Teepee, who you started off the presentation with, that's probably a very non-mild piece of here.
Yes, I spoke with Dave about making sure that her grave site was nice and clean and looked good. So I think my wife and I may have a little side trip as we're going home. Yay! We'll make it a little bit longer. Yes, it's a great question to end on, because these nurses, some of them, well, the Red Cross, Clara Barton, and the professionalization of nursing and military nursing, they certainly had a hand in this. A number of them lived into the 1890s, into the early part of the 20th century. So in some cases, they're actively participating as best they can. And if they aren't, they're certainly informing the conversation. Thank you.
All right, let's give Ron.